On December 8th, 2024, the people of Syria rejoiced as their brutal dictator, Bashar al-Assad, fled the country after 24 years at its helm. Syrians were tasting freedom. So how did that time of celebration morph into the horrific headlines we've now seen only 8 months later? In the same city where the Apostle Paul came to faith in Christ, Christians worshiping in their church in Damascus were killed by a suicide bombing this June. Back in March, along the coast, more than 1,000 Alawite Syrians were slaughtered in what the new government claims were isolated acts of violence. And just in July, another wave of attacks in southern Syria's predominantly Druze Sweda region also killed well over 1,000 people. So now that Assad is gone, what is driving the violence in Syria? My name is Abby, and I'm your host here at the Christian Solidarity Podcast, where we stand as one with the body of Christ facing persecution around the world. At Christian Solidarity International, CSI, we partner with local Christian organizations to support religious freedom and human dignity for everyone. Our goal is to help followers of Christ of all different traditions stand together with those facing persecution. In a 24/7 news cycle, it can feel overwhelming to even know where to begin. So we want to help you stay informed, give practically, pray consistently, and speak out about the suffering happening in the world, with our hope always in Christ's ultimate redemption. Our partners are located in Sudan, Nigeria, Pakistan, and more. And today, we're talking about Syria. On the podcast today with me is Dr. Joel Veldkamp, CSI's Director for Public Advocacy. He has his PhD in history from the Geneva Graduate Institute for a dissertation about the Christians of Aleppo who were living in Syria during the French Mandate period between World War I and World War II. And he also has firsthand experience living in Syria. He was working there in 2011 when the Arab Spring uprisings began. So Joel, thank you so much for speaking with us today. And now we are going to jump right in. Okay, so we have been seeing a lot of headlines about Syria recently, and there's been a latest round of violence just this month in July happening in the Sweda region of Syria. Joel, can you give us an introduction to what that's been about?
Sure. So the Sweda region of Syria is special because the people who live there are almost 90% from the same religious group, a religious group called the Druzes. This is an offshoot of Shiite Islam that began around the 11th century. They make up about 3% of Syria's population total, and most of them live in Sweda. Now, during the Syrian civil war, they weren't with the government, with the dictatorship per se, but they formed militias to defend themselves against the jihadists who formed the backbone of the rebellion against the dictatorship. Why was this necessary? Because in the Sunni Muslim jihadist worldview, Druzes are considered as heretics, as people who have departed from the truth of Islam, who should be killed or enslaved. That's the ruling on Islamic law that these groups follow. So they had to defend themselves during the civil war, and they formed their own militias and their own self-defense groups to basically protect Sweda from outsiders. When the Assad regime fell in December, they participated in driving Syrian troops out of their region, and since then, Sweda has basically been under the control of these Druze militias. They haven't declared independence or anything like that, but they've just kind of been in this quiet standoff with the new Syrian government, which was formed by the jihadist groups that were fighting against the Assad dictatorship. And what happened last month was this standoff turned into a hot conflict. The Syrian government sent troops into Sweda to try to take control over Sweda. Ostensibly, this was in response to fighting between Druzes and other Muslims in the area. I don't buy it, but, time will tell. In any case, the Syrian government used this as a reason to send its own troops into Sweda to try to take Sweda over. And as they went, they committed numerous atrocities against Druzes. I've seen terrible videos online of men being shot as they are forced to jump off a balcony, for example. other forms of executions, older Druze men having their mustaches forcibly shaved off. In the Druze religion, having a mustache is very important for men. So this was a clear case of religious hatred motivating religious violence by government troops against Druze civilians. And this violence went on for about a week. And in the end, the only thing that stopped this from turning into a much larger massacre was that Israel started bombing the Syrian government and the Syrian troops that were on their way to Sueda and forced them to withdraw. So now we're basically back to where we were. The Syrian government is determined to conquer Sueda, and it seems the only way they have to do that is by sending in troops who are going to commit atrocities against Druze civilians. And the Druze militias are not going to accept this. So the stage is set for further mass killings, I'm afraid.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, it's really horrific to even hear the stories that you talked about. Even before this happened, we actually had an event in Geneva in Switzerland at the UN Human Rights Council focused on the situation for religious minorities in Syria already happening. And that was before this last attack had taken place. So even before this had happened, why did we feel like this was relevant and necessary? Can you explain some of the thinking that went into hosting this event at the beginning of July?
Sure. So maybe we should say that the fall of the Assad regime in December was almost completely unexpected by everyone. No one really saw this coming, that in just 11 days, these rebel groups that had been confined to a tiny little province of Syria called Idlib could march across the whole country and take the capital city of Damascus. And the fear was at the time that these groups would carry out atrocities against religious minorities, like the Druzes, like the Alawites, like Christians. But at the time, they didn't. At the time, they were very disciplined. They didn't hurt hardly any civilians, and they were constantly broadcasting these messages that you don't have to be afraid of us. We're not going to hurt you. The new Syria will be for all Syrians. It doesn't matter what your religion is. And that had basically been the only reason that anyone was supporting the Assad regime in 2024 was fear of what would happen if he fell. So when they took that fear away, the Assad regime crumbled very quickly. And after that, everyone was just kind of hoping that the new regime would keep its promises. And for a few months, they did. But the dam really broke in March. In March, the Syrian government organized horrific massacres of a religious group called the Alawites in the coastal region of Syria, and even beyond the coastal region as well. That doesn't get talked about as much, but in Damascus, there were massacres of Alawites. In Hama province, there were massacres of Alawites organized by government troops. We don't know exactly how many people were killed, but it's in the thousands. This is like something out of the Yugoslav war. It's among the worst atrocities of the entire Syrian civil war going back to 2011. And what was weird was directly after that, there was a session of the Human Rights Council at the United Nations, where you and I both were, Abby. And both of us heard the members of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria presenting to the whole Human Rights Council. We were at events about Syria. We heard different diplomatic delegations talking about Syria. No one was highlighting this. No one really wanted to talk about it. And so we at CSI decided, well, we better start talking about it at the UN. So that was the impetus for us to have this event on July 1st, where we brought in Fabrice Bolanche and Joshua Landis, two of the world's best experts on Syria, to talk about the threat to religious minorities under the new regime. And unfortunately, the things they had to say at that event have proved very prophetic.
Yeah. Well, and even with the timing at that Human Rights Council session, also, we had the statement on Syria with stating our concerns, stating this warning of potential genocide for the Alawite population in Syria. And we had planned that well in advance. But the day that we actually delivered that at the Human Rights Council session was the day after the church bombing in Damascus. And, while that was not carried out with the same length and scale, as the attacks on the Druzes and the Alawites have been, it was part of this concern that we've had that the government is not protecting religious minorities and that the situation seems to be continually worsening and getting more and more serious. When we're talking about religious minorities in Syria, we have mentioned so far Christians, Druzes, Alawites. Can you explain a little bit about who each of those groups are?
Sure. So Alawites and Druzes are both offshoots of Islam, of Shiite Islam to be specific, but they're quite unique, we can say. We probably wouldn't recognize much about them that's familiar that we know about other Muslim groups. Both of them, for example, don't seek converts and they only marry within their own groups. And that's partly because they believe in reincarnation. They believe you have to be born an Alawite or you have to be born a Druze. Most of them don't keep Sharia law the same way that most Muslims do. It's not to say that they aren't religious, they're very religious, but their religion is very different to what we would know as mainstream Islam. So the Alawites live mostly on the coast of Syria, the Mediterranean coast, because that's a rather mountainous region, and historically that's been a place where they could be safe from the Islamic empires that ruled Syria and from other people who might want to hurt them. Same with the Druzes. They live in southern Syria, again, in a mountainous region called Druze Mountain, or Mountain of the Arabs, if you want to be more politically correct as a Syrian. But they both are what we call compact minorities. They all kind of live together in the same place. Christians, of course, have been in Syria since before the Apostle Paul converted to Christianity. And today they kind of live everywhere in Syria, mostly in cities like Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, but also in smaller villages, particularly in the mountains north of Damascus or in the plains south of Damascus, in northeast Syria, where many of them are descendants of survivors of the great Armenian and Assyrian genocides, the great genocide of Christians that the Ottoman Empire carried out during World War I. There's also an area called the Valley of the Christians, which is the only Christian majority area in Syria. In most places where Christians live, they're a minority and they live alongside their Muslim neighbors.
So, for the Christians in Syria, can you tell us a little about them and paint the picture of who are these people?
Sure. So Christians, of course, have been in Syria for nearly 2,000 years, since before the Apostle Paul converted to Christianity. There were already Christians in Damascus and in other places in Syria. So Christianity in Syria really goes back to the very beginnings of the church. And most Christians in Syria speak Arabic, but there are also many who speak Armenian, again, because they're descendants of survivors of the Armenian genocide who found refuge in Syria after the genocide. There are also some Christians in Syria who speak Aramaic, or versions of Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus himself spoke, as best as we can tell. And that just points again to how ancient Christianity is in Syria. They belong to 11 different churches, mostly varieties of Catholicism or Orthodoxy, but there are also evangelicals and Protestants who live in Syria.
Yeah, and so as we're looking at the situation now, are Christians directly targeted? Are they the focus of these attacks, or how does that play in? How does it compare for the situation for Christians versus for Druzes and Alawites, which sounds like it's a little bit different?
For the most part, Christians have not yet been directly targeted by the new government, and that's for several reasons. One is that Christians were not as closely associated with the Assad dictatorship as Alawites were, for example. President Assad himself was an Alawite, so it's easy to pin his crimes, and there were many crimes, horrible crimes that he committed. It's easy to pin his crimes on the Alawite community. Another reason is that, again, in this Islamic jihadist worldview, Christians have a place. If Christians are willing to submit to Islamic rule and pay extra taxes and not interfere with the practice of Islam, then they should be allowed to live in peace. Whereas there's no such provisions for Alawites and Druzes, again, for these extreme groups that formed the backbone of the rebel coalition that took power in December, not for all Muslims. So they have that kind of layer of protection. Also, the new Syrian government really wants approval from the West, and they need the support of the United States and Europe and other Western countries in order to rebuild and consolidate their power. And they know that violence against Christians can really hurt that effort. So for the time being, they're being very careful with the Christians. But that's not to say that everything is good. As you mentioned, Abby, there was a horrendous church bombing on June 22 that killed between 25 and 30 Christians who were at worship when the suicide bomber detonated himself inside their sanctuary. That's something that has never happened before in Syria. Never. Syria has almost always been a safe place for Christians. And this event really has sent an awful signal to the Christians of Syria that this place is not going to be safe for you anymore. What's worse is that the government's response to this attack was really not convincing. They immediately blamed ISIS for the attack, like way earlier than it would have been possible to know who was responsible for the attack. They said it was ISIS. And within 24 hours, they rounded up all these suspects who they blamed the attack on. That was not taken very seriously, I have to say, by most Syrians. No senior government officials, including the president, went to the funeral of these victims. None of them visited the church. And the president refused to use the Arabic word for martyrs to describe the people who were killed in the church. And that's not a coincidence. He's following Salafist jihadist teaching in refusing to honor Christian victims of violence this way. So this is a very bad sign. And it's a sign to Christians that they're no longer going to be safe in Syria. It's also a sign to people in Syria who might want to hurt Christians that the door is kind of open for this.
Yeah. And despite the vast differences in their beliefs, from what we've talked about and what we've heard from our partners, it sounds like really Christians and Druzes and Alawites are in some ways kind of coming together to say that they have shared concerns, right? And they're not voicing these concerns publicly, but the concerns are the same. Can you weigh in a little bit on that and what that relationship is between these groups?
Sure. And I would say it's not just between these three religious groups, but there are many, many Syrians, including Muslim Syrians, who are extremely concerned about the direction that their country is going, who don't want a hardline Islamic regime to rule Syria, who don't want a new dictatorship in Syria. And to their credit, some of them are protesting. When government troops were attacking Sueda a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago now, there was a protest in Damascus of ordinary Syrians, Muslim Syrians, Christian Syrians coming together saying it is haram for Syrians to shed the blood of other Syrians. That was their message. It's forbidden. Should not be happening. And unfortunately, they were attacked by pro-government thugs who beat them up and dispersed them. So we are entering a very tense time in Syria. And we're going to need lots of brave Syrians to speak up for the future that they want to have in their country. But certainly in Sueda, we're seeing a lot of cooperation between church leaders and Druze leaders for the good of the people who live in that province. And yeah, we have to hope that these sorts of cooperations will be effective.
Yeah. So before December, all of these religious minorities were already living in Syria under the Assad regime. And so what was it like for them at that point? What did life look like prior to this takeover by HTS in these Islamist groups?
So as you said before, Abby, when the Assad regime fell, almost all Syrians were rejoicing because the Assad regime was really brutal and really terrible. It was one of the worst police states in the world. Its crimes were among the worst of the 21st century. This is a dictator who launched chemical weapons attacks on civilian neighborhoods in Damascus, killing thousands of people. This is a dictator who disappeared tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Syrians into his labyrinth, his maze of prisons, from which very few Syrians emerged alive. So this was a regime where everyone had to be careful all the time not to say the wrong thing, not to trust anybody. It was not a happy political situation, we can say. But the regime as I said before, was headed by an Alawite. And for that reason, he had a very strong interest in Syria remaining a secular state and in religious minorities having a stake in that state. His kind of coalition of support included religious minorities who were afraid of a jihadist takeover of Syria and who clung to his regime for protection. That was his ace in the hole, that if you lose me, you're going to lose your protection. So I wouldn't say anyone or very many Christians, Alawites, or Druzes really loved the Assad regime. But for many, he was seen as a better alternative than ISIS, for example, or than Jabhat al-Nusra, the group that eventually became HTS, which eventually took over the country in December. So we're in uncharted territory here.
Yeah. Yeah, and so then today, what is driving the violence against religious minorities in Syria?
Yeah, I think we should not overlook this worldview, this what I might call the Salafist jihadist worldview, for lack of better terms, that really classifies Syrians according to their religious group. So on top of this hierarchy, you have Sunni Muslims. At an inferior rung, you have Christians who should be allowed to remain in an Islamic state, but not as equals. And then down below, you have Alawites and Druzes who have to be killed or enslaved or driven out. There's no place for them in an Islamic state. This is not the program that the Syrian government is implementing directly, but this is the ideology that the fighters who took control of Syria in December have been marinating in for almost a decade and a half. For example, many brigades among the rebel groups during the civil war named themselves after Ibn Taymiyyah, a Sunni Muslim Islamic scholar from the 13th century, who famously issued a fatwa, a religious ruling, saying that it is necessary to kill Alawites. This is the name that they took for themselves, right? This is how they framed the entire 14-year-long civil war. We are Muslims fighting against the Alawites to set up an Islamic state. And that attitude, that mindset has not gone away, regardless of what public statements the new Syrian president Ahmed al-Sharaa has made, saying that all Syrians can live here, everyone's going to be safe. His soldiers on the street, who are now the police, who are now the army, who are now border guards, what have you, they still have this mindset. And in that situation, it's going to be very difficult to prevent more violence like the kind that we saw in Sweden 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. So what do you think we should be watching for and expecting in the future?
Things look very bad right now, to be honest. Something that we haven't discussed yet, but just as Sweden province in the south is kind of an autonomous region, most of northeast Syria is still under the control of the new Syrian government. It's under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces, who are led by Syrian Kurds. Damascus likewise wants to retake this territory, and the Syrian Kurds likewise are kind of saying no without saying no. There's this standoff between the two sides, and I'm really concerned about what will happen when that clash comes. That's going to be very bad for Christians in northeast Syria particularly, and for the Kurds. But so we have this kaleidoscope of conflicts along religious lines centered against a new government in Damascus that emerged from a jihadist coalition that sees most of these groups as infidels, as heretics. This is really an explosive situation. So I'm afraid we should expect more mass killings in the months to come. Even without mass killings, we're seeing a steady stream of Alawite women, for example, who are being kidnapped and never seen again. We're seeing Christians and Druzes and Alawites being kidnapped and showing up dead a few days later. We're seeing Alawites being driven off of their lands by their Sunni neighbors without any kind of accountability. So there is this slow driving people out of the country. And already in Lebanon, I'd have to check the statistics, but I think there are 100,000 new Syrian refugees since December in Lebanon alone because of these new conflicts. So I'm afraid we're heading towards, if not a total genocide, then at the very least slow ethnic cleansing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been such a roller coaster, even just hearing the reports from CSI's partners in Syria, the initial excitement after Assad left the country, and then moving to the concerns with the massacres of the Alawites in March, but then moving to excitement again with the sanctions being lifted, which is something that CSI advocated for years, for
Absolutely.
these broad general sanctions to go away because of how absolutely horrible the economic situation was. But then again, it was followed and surrounded by these attacks on the Druze and the bombing of the church in Damascus and the attacks in general in the Sweda region. And so with all of that, right, it's a country that's already been through so much. I remember 10 years ago seeing the headlines about Syria, and now it's like this moment of hope that has then plunged into another unfolding disaster. So what can people listening do to speak out about this, to help to try to curb this tide that we see happening right now?
The only thing that's going to make a difference at this stage is if the United States and the European Union really press the Syrian government to stop massacring religious minorities in no uncertain terms. So far, they don't seem inclined to do that. The United States, for some reason, seems to have gone all in on Ahmed al-Sharaa. They seem to think that he's their guy who's going to deliver for them, to the extent that when Israel bombed Syrian forces in July to stop them from massacring the Druzes, the United States was publicly upset at Israel for this, saying, "Don't bomb Damascus, don't bomb our guy. What are you doing? You're ruining things for us." And unfortunately, this fits a pattern in American foreign policy that we've seen for decades, which is that American policymakers keep coming around to the idea that they can use Sunni jihadists for their own benefit. They are wrong. They've been wrong before, and they're wrong this time, and they're going to regret it. So this is the message that anyone who's in touch with their lawmakers needs to be bringing to their lawmakers. At CSI, we'll soon be launching the petition for a specific Syrian Christian man who's in prison, the former mayor of a town called Saadad. His name is Suleiman Khalil. He's been in prison for 6 months now with no access to a lawyer, no charges, and he needs to be let out. So we're going to be campaigning for him, and we invite you to join us in that campaign, to sign our petition. And if you do, you'll connect with us and we'll keep you informed about other advocacy actions you can take in the future.
Thank you, Joel. That's all for today. If you have comments or questions, we'd love to hear from you. You can comment directly on your listening platform or contact us through our website at csi-int.org. If this episode was encouraging, convicting, or eye-opening, be sure to share it with a friend and hit subscribe so that you can get updates as they come out. I'm Abby McDougal, and this is the Christian Solidarity Podcast. Thank you for listening.